How do you feel about fermented foods? Things like live sauerkrauts, yogurts, kimchi. We could go on and on. There's a lot of different ones available these days. The general assumption with those is that these bacteria that are still alive within those foods are making it down to our digestion and repopulating. So, two different parts there. Are they beneficial in a general sense? And then, two, do they actually repopulate like people assume?
So most people will consider fermented foods as a probiotic food, right? And I was invited to do a talk at like the Santa Barbara Fermentation Festival, big fermentation festival. They're like, oh, here's a microbiologist with all this microbiome knowledge. We'd love him to talk. My first sentence in my talk, and I thought either I'll be chased out of there with pitchforks or people will listen. My first statement was fermented foods are not probiotic foods. They're not a source of probiotics, right? And people are like, what? What the hell is he talking about? We thought that was the whole benefit from it. Well, it's not. The point of fermented foods is not to deliver bacteria to your system, because those bacteria are designed to ferment the food outside of the body. And they do so under their own specialized conditions. They don't function inside the body. The moment you eat them, they're all going to die in the gastric system. The stomach acid's going to kill all those bacteria. So it's not about delivering bacteria. What it is about, it's about delivering super nutrients, right? So fermented foods are foods that now contain nutrients that the food naturally did not contain. And those new nutrients come about from the fermentation process, right? You're putting bacteria to break down the normal substrates of the food, and they're creating byproducts that are now super nutrients, right? These are similar to the byproducts that will be created in your gut, right? Remember, your large bowel is a fermentation vessel, right? So let's say you take sauerkraut, right? And a fermented sauerkraut. Let's say you had a non-fermented version of the substrate itself, the vegetable. You eat that. What's supposed to happen is that's supposed to go into your large bowel, and for the next 8 to 10 hours, it gets fermented and becomes sauerkraut in your large bowel, right? Now, assuming you don't have enough diversity, the conditions aren't right, you may not get adequate fermentation out of it. But doing it outside of the body, in a way, and then consuming it gives your system an edge, because you are producing all of those wonderful nutrients that come as a result of the fermentation, right? So what are the things that are produced during fermentation? Well, microbes that ferment certain foods will take the basic substrates like the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the fats, and they'll produce things like peptides, like dipolonic acid, for example, is a wonderful peptide that can reduce inflammation and help circulation and help blood pressure and all kinds of things. They produce urolithins, which help your mitochondria repair themselves and kick off autophagy and mitophagy. So removing damaged cells and cellular debris. They produce short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, right? So they produce all of these, and an array of vitamins and minerals and all of these things. So fermented foods are basically nutrient-dense packed foods that can be very beneficial, assuming that you're not sensitive to that particular type of ferment, right? Because some ferments will have high levels of histamine in it, which is a natural byproduct of the fermentation. So some people with histamine intolerance, for example, may consume that and it may be reactive to them, right? So if you have a fermented food that you can make yourself or somebody around you makes, or that you can buy from a somewhat traditional source, and you consume it and it agrees with your system, it's perfectly great for your system, right? I would always encourage people to consume that. There's certain fermented foods that really work well. Like I love kimchi, right? I would put kimchi on anything. I come from South India, and in South India, we have a lot of fermented lentils. And in fact, we make breads out of the fermented lentils and so on. So that to me is very staple for my system. But some people may not, sauerkraut or kefir, things like that may not agree with them. If it doesn't agree with you, don't do it, right? Find a fermented food that does agree with you. And if you can create it yourself, that's really the best, right? When you look at an example of that is kombucha, natural, actual made kombucha using traditional techniques can be very beneficial for you, right? Because they have all these amazing organic acids in them. and organic acids are really good for the gut. But store-bought kombucha in the bottle is not even kombucha, right? They put the label of kombucha on it, but they don't complete the fermentation because the fermentation takes too long. It makes it less commercially viable. They add a bunch of sugar and flavoring and colorants and things like that in it. So then it negates a lot of the benefit, right? But if you can make your own kombucha at home, do that.
As you're talking about these different nutrients that get unlocked when we ferment, and then we still get benefits from taking those in, but again, not the benefits that a lot of people would assume from the bacteria being alive. It gets me thinking about the difference between creating those nutrients within the colon versus taking them in, having to go through the stomach acid, small intestine, and then get to the colon. Things like, the peptides you mentioned and different nutrients, are they stable to go through that and to get the benefits when they get down to the colon?
When you think about the nutrients that come in from the fermented food, so the peptides, the enzymes, the fatty acids, the organic acids, all of these beneficial things that are being made during the fermentation process that we want as nutrients, whether those make it through the gastric system or not, the answer is pretty clear that they actually do, right? So the gastric system doesn't dismantle nutrition so much. The gastric system has two real big functionalities. Number one, it's to kill off organisms so that we don't unnecessarily bring in huge loads of viable organisms. And I think more so from food, what we're trying to protect against are microbes from the mouth. Right. And I'll elaborate on that in a second. But we want the gastric system to act as a gastric barrier to kill microbes that are trying to come in through the digestive system. And then the second part of it is to aid in digestion, especially in the digestion of protein. Right. So the gastric system really, really is important for the digestion of protein. So if you think about a piece of chicken, for example, the protein in the chicken is a string of amino acids, like think of a string of pearls, but it's folded in all of these complicated structures, right? It's called secondary and tertiary folding. So the amino acids and the protein is not actually accessible to us in that structure, right? It's incredibly hard to get to in that folded structure. So what needs to happen is that folded structure needs to be unraveled, and the stomach acid helps do that. So there are all these bonds that hold a structure folded. They're called van der Waals forces and hydrogen bonds. And then acid breaks up those bonds. So they go from a folded structure like this to a long string of pearls of amino acids. So then from your stomach, the protein moves into the small intestines as a long string of amino acids, right? And then enzymes go to work on it. You've got peptidases and proteases that start chopping up that long string of amino acids into individual amino acids, which is what we assimilate and absorb. Now, the microbial part of it, the microbes on the fermented foods and the microbes from raw foods, like if we eat, something off our garden, even though those microbes are getting killed in the stomach by the stomach acid, which is what we want, you actually still get some benefit from those microbes because of a couple components. Number one, the internal cell of the microbe. So you think about the microbial cell like this, right? It's a whole cell with a defined structure. What the acid does is it actually causes a cell to blow up, right? So it's called lysing the cell, which is blowing it up open. So now the internal components of the cell are now exposed to us, and there's lots of beneficial things in that internal component. There are RNA components that can affect gene expression within us. There are enzymes, there are peptides, there are lots of things that we can utilize inside that cell. We may absorb and utilize it in our own needs. The other thing is the components of the cell. So the outer components of the cell that's now in pieces, as that moves through the digestive system, it gets sampled by the immune system. That's how the immune system learns what kind of microbes are in your environment, right? And it builds tolerance against those microbes if it's microbes coming in with food, right? It goes, this is a normal microbe. It's not a pathogen. I don't have to go crazy and attack it every time I see it. I'm going to build some tolerance against it. So I allow it to come through, but I monitor it, right? And this is how your system adapts to the environment that you're in. Now, I mentioned the oral microbes. The oral microbiome is full of problematic organisms, right? They're fine when they're in the oral cavity, but if your gums become leaky and they leak into your circulation, that becomes a big problem. Or if they're allowed to move through the digestive system in a viable state, they can cause a lot of issues. For example, if you look at SIBO, SIBO is a very prevalent condition, right? Small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. There's a fundamental shift in the types of microbes that predominate the small bowel in people with SIBO versus people who don't have SIBO. When you look at what those microbes are, there's a lot of Enterobacter, Enterococcus. These are not normal microbes that are found in the small intestine, but these are microbes that are found at high levels in the mouth. And so people with SIBO often have issues with their gastric system. They're producing low levels of stomach acid. So many of these microbes that you swallow every day through the gallons of spit that you swallow, those microbes are not getting killed in the stomach. They're making it to the small intestine in a viable state where they can then proliferate and cause small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. This is why there's something called PPI-induced SIBO. PPIs are proton pump inhibitors, right? Proton pump inhibitors reduce stomach acid production. It's used as a way of dealing with symptoms for people that get reflux, right? And so when you reduce stomach acid, you end up with SIBO because these microbes are going into a viable state.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
Adding spores to a gut microbiome in 3 weeks increased the diversity of the gut microbiome by almost 25 to 30%. And it increased the growth of keystone species, and it brought down pathogens. So the spores are like the police or the orchestrator.